Hi everyone. So my name is Catrina and I'm from Young Friends of the Earth Scotland, and I'm here to chat to you today about climate change as a queer and feminist issue. I'm not like an expert on this. I'm not like in terms of kind of the more like academic side of things. I'm not like I won't be able to answer really in-depth questions about theory and stuff, but I'm here to kind of give a wee bit of like an overview of like how these issues are connected, and hopefully afterwards we can have a bit more discussion about it. But I've got some slides to share. I'm not like, if you've been to the Divest Pride event that People and Planet hosted, some of these slides may be quite familiar to you, but they are a little bit different. They're not the most prepared. Oh, Maddie, could you make me a co-host so I can share my screen? Sorry, I thought I could already do it. Just got my wee slides, which are mostly there so that I remember what to say and don't have to look at my own face for 10 to 15 minutes.
I think Margaret, can you do it? Yeah.
Cool. There we go. Okay. And can we all see? Yep. Cool. Okay. So yeah, the kind of basis of where I'm coming from on this is around climate justice. So through climate justice, we know that climate change isn't just an environmental issue, it's a social and a political issue as well. And the kind of, when we're talking about kind of this is a feminist issue and a queer issue, we're thinking about how the kind of systems that devalue and exploit people, but also the environment, they can't be tackled in isolation, they reinforce one another. And this like constant drive for material accumulation for the benefit of the elites. And it's this kind of like climate justice linking in all of these different systems together. And today we're talking mostly about like patriarchy, marginalized genders and sexualities, but that is just like one part of this. And we kind of want to acknowledge that it does intersect with like other kind of systems of oppression. So thinking particularly about like race. And yeah, not to ignore that, but this is just the kind of focus that we're going to have. And I also wanted to kind of, in the framing of this, kind of, we talked about queerness and feminism, and I don't want to separate those as like completely different. Like we're not talking about like queer people and women as separate. It's kind of this idea of like marginalized genders and sexualities and them being really connected. But yeah, climate change is definitely a gendered issue, and climate change is definitely a queer issue. And if I can find my little thing that lets me change slides, there it is. So this is a wee quote from somebody from Friends of the Earth, England, Wales and Northern Ireland, which I thought was like just a really good kind of like summary, and I'll read it for you now. So, the current capitalist neo-colonial economic model based on violent resource extraction reflects a dangerous hierarchy of values: growth over sustenance, production over reproduction, north over global south, and masculinity over femininity. It's a patriarchal model that undermines the conditions needed to sustain life while relying on and enforcing women's socially constructed roles as caregivers to obscure its devastating cost. And I guess in that I would also add, in this kind of like masculinity over femininity, there's kind of heterosexuality over queerness in that same kind of like model reflecting it. So first I'm going to talk about the kind of like roots of climate change and roots of different kind of oppressions, and I've just clicked too far, and kind of thinking a bit firstly about gender and about kind of women. So capitalism, the heteropatriarchy and exploitation of nature are all kind of connected. Ecofeminists draw on kind of concept of gender and often how like women are treated. Sorry, I keep clicking on the wrong slides. Your recording's going to be not the best. But they use that to analyze the relationship between humans and the natural world as well. And I'm not super well read on ecofeminism, but these are just kind of key points I pulled out. So often we see nature as like feminine, kind of mother nature, whereas civilization and culture is seen as more masculine. And then we get this kind of like domination, exploitation, conquering nature. And that can be compared to the same kind of domination of women, but also kind of people that don't conform to traditional masculinity as well. And there's also this idea of like nature as property, woman as property, and this kind of, as well within capitalism, we have this like hidden labor traditionally done by women which is like a key part of how capitalism works. We have women like doing all of the childcare and the household tasks and all of this that like allow the other things to happen, and that's like often like invisible labor and kind of be compared to this kind of hidden exploitation of natural resources as well. So this is kind of like, yeah, these comparisons that come from ecofeminism, and just seeing how these like different systems, the oppression, like gender-based oppression, and this kind of exploitation of the natural environment, actually it's kind of like the same like worldview that leads to those things. And then in terms of like queerness, I think it's, see, when I want to change the slide, I can't. There we go, and I've clearly changed it too far. In terms of queerness, again, like through climate justice, we know that like climate change is tied up, the roots of it are like loads of different oppressions. And I think particularly with queerness, we need to look at colonialism and capitalism. So with colonialism, like the kind of Western invading forces that went to these different places, often like quite like Christian, they really brutally attempted to wipe out this diversity of gender and sexuality that was often found in Indigenous communities. And the kind of these same forces also brought environmental exploitation, like extractivism, degradation. So it's kind of linked in that way. And as well, like anti-capitalism has always been kind of really important to queer liberation, and it's all equally important to the fight against the climate crisis. The same kind of, yeah, these same systems are all wrapped up together. And I think, yeah, anti-capitalism is just like just a key part of like both of it. And this, is it going to change? Nope. There we go. Okay. I think I've actually changed it more than I wanted to. There. So I'm going to talk a bit about like the impacts of climate change. Climate change, oh, I'm really sorry about this. I'm not used to this computer. Climate change exacerbates already existing inequalities like across the world, across loads of different countries, and it's argued to uniquely affect women in a way like across the world. And this is like particularly relevant when we're talking about like countries in the global south. So women make up the majority of the world's poor. Women across the world are responsible for most agricultural work and food production that happens, and they're often like most like relying on kind of like natural resources like directly. So it means that they are more vulnerable to environmental degradation and to things that come with climate change, like lost harvests, drought, scarcity of resources. So often in countries, like women will be like kind of farming the land, they'll be the ones that are collecting the firewood, collecting the water, and when these changes happen, they're kind of like the first to be affected and like, yeah, like kind of bear the brunt of that. And also women often have less, because of like discrimination, misogyny, less access to resources that you might need to escape like natural disasters, extreme weather events. And they're also often denied survival skills that they need due to cultural norms. So like an example often used, Bangladesh floods a lot, and it's just not like women don't learn how to swim, and it leaves them way more vulnerable. And often like when natural disasters come, like the women are the ones who have to kind of like, they're the caregivers, they need to find all the kids, they can't just like run and leave in the same way, and it often leaves them more vulnerable. And studies have found that like women are more likely to be killed in natural disasters than men are. And as well, like in times of like high stress and crisis, it can lead to like increased violence against women. So it's this kind of like pressure that comes with climate change exacerbates all these already existing inequalities. And this is also true of queer people as well. And I'm going to try and wait and see if it changes my slide. No, there we go. So queer people as well are disproportionately affected by climate change. Queer people are more likely to live in areas of greater risk of climate change and environmental degradation, particularly those people that live in poverty and people of colour. So they're more likely to be kind of places at risk of like floods or hurricane and things like that. They're again less likely to have access to resources and ability to relocate. They're more likely to be homeless. So for instance, in the UK, 24% of homeless youth are LGBT. And if you're homeless, you're really exposed to kind of extreme weather events and things like that. And queer people are also, again, more likely to face persecution in times of crisis. So, for instance, like when Hurricane Katrina happened in New Orleans, there's loads of incidences of like trans people being turned away from shelters or discriminated when they were like in the shelters. And as well, like queer people often have more trouble like crossing borders as well when it comes to kind of like relocating away from these issues. And there's a picture there which is from Hurricane Michael in Florida, and it's like an LGBT center which was just completely like devastated by the hurricane, and they were like kind of like as a community didn't have as much funds and resources and support to be able to kind of rebuild that again. And I think that was just like a really nice, yeah, kind of example of that like extra vulnerability to these kind of things. And again, there we go. So yeah, the next thing I want to talk about is fossil fuel companies who are driving the climate crisis. They also love to use the very people they are harming to try and make themselves look better. And a really good example of this is companies like Barclays and Shell and Exxon sponsoring prides. And they're, yeah, have their like rainbow logos. It gives them social license. And it's not just that, they'll do like loads of like promo stuff about like, yeah, we're so great, even though we're disproportionately harming LGBT people. And that's, I think, in terms of like your campaigning and you're thinking about like how these issues are interconnected, like how does that surface? Where can I take practical action like against these things and point out these things? I think often like these are the places that these connections come up in our lives. And with the kind of like gender as well on my next slide, if it will, I don't know why this is happening. There we go. Yeah, they love to do it with feminism as well, climate change, but feminist. They love, there's like a Shell, like they did a big like gender balance campaign. Exxon, like I can't remember what it was like called, like I can't remember, it was like She Matters or something, but Shell changed their name to Shield at one point and had this like big campaign about like women in STEM. And they do loads of stuff like promoting like women in like scholarships of women in STEM, and like so that's at the bottom right there is a course that's like at Aberdeen College, which is sponsored by Shell, and it's like girls in energy, come and learn how to be a girl boss with fossil fuels. But that is, yeah, you will find that everywhere, and I just think it's kind of really important, yeah, connections to point out. And when we're thinking about these like the roots and the impacts, and actually it kind of makes this stuff like kind of even more horrific. So yeah, that was that one. And then so the next thing I want to talk about is the kind of, yeah, tackling climate change, like understanding it as like a queer and a feminist issue. I think is really important because like you can bring so much more into your how you're like tackling it. So the more that we kind of have this idea of like collective liberation, of bringing struggles together, of seeing them as connected, we're going to be stronger. And I think so if we're talking about like the feminist movement, like they, through like this kind of viewpoint, you can understand way more about the kind of attitude people to have towards the environment. And you can kind of, yeah, the idea of like the patriarchy and like it being like a system, it's really useful. But also the kind of particularly people in kind of like looking at like post-work and just transition, this kind of idea that like traditionally like feminine, like devalued, invisible skills and tasks are actually kind of crucial for creating like the world we need, and creating kind of like economies of care, valuing care work and this invisible kind of stuff, if we're going to have like a world that isn't based on capitalism. And I don't have a lot of time to like fully talk about this stuff, but promo, Young Friends of Earth has a podcast called Decent Jobs on a Living Planet, and our last episode was with an ecological economist who talked about this kind of stuff. So if you did want to go and have a little wee intro to that, you can find it on the podcast. And then, yeah, with queer people as well, like, again, like for a long time, queer people have like recognized the need to kind of connect different struggles. I think most people probably have seen the film like Pride, lesbian gay support the minors, and then maybe heard of like modern iteration, lesbian and gay support the migrants. You can kind of see a picture at the bottom there. Um, and yeah, queer people like have like a long history of struggle and campaigning, but like also winning. And there's like a picture at the top there that's from DC Pride in America, where they were protesting against like what's Wells Fargo sponsoring Pride, and they also were big sponsors of like pipelines that were harming Indigenous communities, and they were kind of bringing all those issues together there. But queer people as well, like having had to kind of support each other when like kind of the rest of the world wouldn't support them in the same way, like often know how to build resilient communities and build like cultures of care and community care, and yeah, know what solidarity looks like. And often, yeah, they're already in the climate movement, they're everywhere, but I think drawing on these kind of skills and ways of looking at things are really important. And then my last slide, this is left over from when I did the Pride chat, but I took it left in because I like the photos. This is just some pictures from the Radical Bloc at Edinburgh Pride last year, kind of connecting these issues of like capitalism and queer issues. And yeah, so that was a very quick run through overview of how these issues are connected and why we should care about them and things that we can do about them. And I hope that was useful. And yeah, hopefully we can have a bit more of a chat, and if anyone has any questions. I'm sorry if I zoomed through that really fast.
No, thank you so much. And if it's necessary, I can pause the recording here if people who arrive late want to change their usernames or anything. But if not, we can just open it up to questions. Maybe say in the chat if you want me to pause it, but if not, we'll just go ahead. Yeah, so if anyone wants to speak, like you should be able to unmute yourself and just ask. And if not, just send it in the chat and I can read it out for you.
I'm definitely also interested if people have kind of stuff they want to add to it, just like general comments or questions they want to ask to each other, not necessarily just from me.
Okay, so we have a question here saying, have you heard of social ecology? I think that it intersects really well with what you've been talking about.
I've heard of it. I'm not well read in it, but I'll definitely look into it. I'm definitely the kind of person that's not learned about this necessarily academically. So yeah, more just from being around and kind of being queer and a feminist and drawing all these connections. But I definitely like appreciate any like recommendations of further reading and things to look into.
Yeah, on that note, actually, so GAF is planning to have another event following up on this one where we're having like a zine workshop, and we're going to put together a list of resources like articles and videos and stuff and images kind of around like the theme of ecofeminism and green consciousness and kind of related topics. So we'll be posting details about that on social media, on Facebook and Twitter, which presumably people here already know where to find us since you're here. But yeah, it would be great to see people here if they want to discuss it further. Actually, I had a question. So you kind of talked about how like the fossil fuel lobbies like co-opt like the LGBT plus movement or like feminism. But have you found that like within say feminist movements there's like maybe a disinterest in ecology, or like does the movement get kind of hampered by other things like within feminist spaces or queer spaces, or is there more of a like obviously there are a lot of great examples of how this solidarity already exists, but have you found anything that kind of worries you or you think needs to be addressed?
I think the biggest thing that worries me when it comes to ecofeminism is the kind of biological essentialism that you find in often in there, and it's not always, but I think I'm definitely like I meant to talk a little bit more about it during that, but I tried to kind of point out it's not just about like women versus men, and it's definitely like like, yeah, patriarchy affects everyone and there's lots of marginalized genders, but that I think is one of the things that, like, when bringing feminism and ecology together, like especially with the massive rise in loudness of TERFy people, at least recently, like that, yeah. And I think that you definitely kind of like touched on a really good point there about often like kind of like feminist groups or queer groups are often like kind of like advocating for like themselves and their needs, and that's like so important. And like as like a kind of primarily like climate organizer, I'm not going to go into their spaces and be like, actually you should be doing stuff on climate change instead, but like I think that like those issues are connected, and like it is a kind of, it's kind of the same way, like you're still protecting or like trying to protect other marginalized people around the world when you're kind of fighting against climate change. And I think it's about, yeah, making those connections and finding the people who are able to work on these issues and are passionate and about work in that like kind of like intersection. And they definitely like, they do exist for sure. But yeah, kind of like it is like a delicate issue, or not delicate, but like I've definitely been in feminist groups before where I've been like, this probably isn't like the right place for me to be like, are we gonna do something about climate change, because it's just like, you know, the other stuff we're dealing with is more about like actual people's day-to-day life and survival. And it can be hard to have those discussions about something so existential when people have this like day-to-day hardship they're trying to deal with.
So we have another question from the chat, asking if you might talk more about the ways of refusing capitalist appropriation of marginalized people to cover up or hide their destruction of the climate and people.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, it's a big question. But it's, yeah, it's such a thing. It makes me so mad. It makes me see, when I was like putting that like shield, like the shell girl boss thing on that, I was just mad. I think that the like divestment movement, particularly with like there's like the kind of divest pride stuff that's kicking off, is so important to point that out. And I think like, yeah, it's greenwashing is just, it's because it is a kind of like a form of greenwashing. It's so prevalent and it's everywhere, and I think it's often about like showing up in these like spaces that they're at and pointing out like exactly like the reality of what they're actually doing, and they're saying all these nice things. And often like if these things, if it's like events like actually disrupting them, like, and be like, no, like we're not going to let you do this, we're not going to let you like show yourself in this way. Like for instance, it was BP held like they had those talks at universities recently, like just before lockdown, where they came and they were like, oh, we're doing this like green chat, and like yeah, I think a group of people went and just didn't even let them talk, just disrupted it and was like, no, like we're not going to let you try and pretend that you're green. Yeah, and I think that those, yeah, it's really effective, like just being like, no, every time you say that you're a nice guy, I'm going to turn up and be like, absolutely not. But it's hard when it's kind of like online and in their marketing, and it's like, you know, billions of dollars of marketing going out there, and often people have like, people who maybe don't have as much of like developed politics will see like, oh great, Shell, there's women in STEM, like that's amazing, like it's great, these girl scientists digging up fossil fuels, that's great. Yeah, I think in that way often it's just about like talking to people about it and getting them to fully understand what they're seeing. But yeah, also, you know, just some, if it's a physical thing, just, you know, maybe some gentle correction of what they've written on their poster. You can do that if you like. But yeah, generally just whenever they say it, argue against them and make that very public, call them out.
Anyone else want to? Oh, so here's someone saying they saw someone paint over a Sainsbury's pinkwashing banner by changing the text to supporting you as long as it's profitable. And yeah, I think this kind of
I love that.
like obviously brings in the need for anti-capitalist struggle in the ecological movement, where like that's kind of the reason for GAF's existence, is that like unfortunately sometimes the kind of mainstream green movements can be kind of co-opted in the same way as feminist movements or queer movements into saying, oh look, like these CEOs are like cutting down their emissions or whatever, and like not wanting to look at the heart of the problem. So I hope that like GAF is able to help out and kind of raising consciousness in these ways. Sorry if anyone has been trying to like ask a question out loud as well. I hope I'm not like interrupting you, but feel free to go at any point.
I think there's a wee question in the box about
yes.
yeah, I'll let you read that.
Oh, sure. Any thoughts on the difficulty of bringing queer issues and feminism into spaces primarily focused on climate change, but maybe lacking an intersectional perspective or diversity in class, etc.?
Yeah, I have many thoughts on this. The climate movement or like environmental movement has historically been like, I mean, just like middle class and white, right? And straight. It's been, I mean, not always straight, but like generally it's not been a very like diverse intersectional movement. And I think that like it is changing, but like if a space like already exists and you need to kind of like challenge the way that it thinks, it's really difficult. And I think like often the best way is like, you know, building your own spaces like from the kind of ground up and thinking about like what your underlying values are, what your aims are, and also like having these agreements of like how you treat each other like in the groups. In terms of like actually like yeah tackling, like I'm thinking of particularly like Extinction Rebellion spaces have had like a real problem with this, and I know that Extinction Rebellion Scotland have been doing this big like intersectionality like process, but it's such a process and it's really hard when the underpinning values of Extinction Rebellion just like they're not really compatible with it because it's so like climate change above everything else. And I think that that's yeah the kind of people that brings in, and like having to try and broaden that mindset is like it is difficult, it's really hard. And yeah, I think that like yeah the best way is kind of building your own spaces and your own kind of like processes for kind of like dealing with conflict, and like yeah making sure you actually like agree on your values and educating about the interconnection between all of these. I think definitely like people that are really into climate change often like you can use that as like a hook to get them to care about other issues when you see like how they are interconnected. And I think this general grasp on like climate justice of seeing like understanding it not just as an environmental issue is really important. I think yeah a lot of like what Young Friends of the Earth like tries to do as a kind of like network and kind of learning space for young people is trying to make those connections and actually like instill those values into people so they can take them into other spaces and yeah have a slightly broader, more complex view of climate change. But yeah, I think definitely like if you have a group and it's like, you know, people aren't really grasping that, like having discussions on kind of like safer spaces policy kind of stuff, general education on like how they're connected and like reasons even beyond just like the political like this is why it strengthens like you know our cause, but like actually like having more people in our group is better, like not excluding people. Like we want more people, we want in our group and like helping us, and it's about kind of like making space for people as well. So it's kind of yeah on the interpersonal level as well as like the bigger level, and trying to like yeah make people understand why it's so important. But it's very hard, and especially when people like there's no time for that, the climate, and then you're like it's challenging. It's challenging, but I think it's crucial. Like we just can't like we can't win without it. There's no way. So that's yeah.
Can I add something on that? Yeah, I think one thing is like it's sometimes like really overwhelming to think about like all the problems in the world, and like you know when you think about the climate crisis and like you know feminist issues and blah blah blah, and like so I think that there is like a space for like single issue campaigns like for feminism or whatever queerness and like because I guess in like those campaigns are breaking down a hierarchy which is patriarchy, and that's kind of like laying the groundwork for breaking down the same hierarchy which causes the climate crisis. So I think like yeah like it's difficult to like address all the issues, and like sometimes it is easier just like focus on one thing, but also I guess it's just like being aware that they are all connected. But yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely agree that like I think single issue campaigns like can be the most effective, like kind of, you know, dismantling stuff brick by brick. I definitely agree. But like you said, I think it's that having the understanding of the wider stuff and being able to make space for people and not kind of do actions accidentally that are like super insensitive to something else. Like if you have that kind of broader understanding, then you're going to be better. But like, yeah, I'm definitely, yeah, I don't think that everybody should be tackling everything at once, because then that's just overwhelming and chaotic. But yeah, I agree with you there.
Yeah, great. Any more questions? I guess the other thing is, with the whole idea of like climate as a single issue, like it can be very difficult because of especially since the coronavirus pandemic, like the rise of ecofascism and saying like, you know, humans are the virus and like climate is the only thing that matters. And even going to the point where you blame certain people for climate change and therefore like dismiss their human rights and so on. Yeah, so I think like this intersectional approach, like it's always been important, but maybe now more than ever, like we really need to be focusing on it. Yeah, so like it's especially, it's good to just remind yourself that a lot of this kind of solidarity already exists, but we always need to be really conscious of trying to make space for it, I think.